Frankly, I think the information that's on the record now and the admissions by the president and the transcript or the report of the telephone call wasn't a full transcript that was given to us by the White House, as well as other corroborating witnesses that are just sort of coming forward every day. There's enough information right now, in my view. Now, this is a serious time. Nobody ought to be happy in America about this happening. Our founding fathers established this process, very frankly, for exactly this purpose. Not necessarily a criminal activity when they call high crime and misdemeanor, but for abuse of power. When you read the scholars talking about what the impeachment process is all about, it's really about dealing with abuse of power. Our founding fathers were afraid of a king or a dictator going wild and doing things contrary to the Constitution, contrary to our laws. And very frankly, we have delayed, as you know, proceeding with an impeachment inquiry for a long time because we believe it is a serious matter, not to be taken lightly. But in light of the facts that we are confronted with now, our responsibility and indeed our duty is to proceed, and we will proceed where the facts lead us. But as I said, in my view, right now, on the admissions of the president as to the fact that he tried to influence a foreign government to interfere in our election process, puts at stake the integrity of our elections and our national security.
It truly does.
That in and of itself would warrant looking carefully at whether impeachment should follow. The answer to that question is yes, but it is not a quick process. Obviously, the executive can act quickly and can refuse quickly. And the Congress, essentially, we have no army, we have no police force, although we have the Capitol Police Force for protection of visitors and members and the Capitol structure itself. But the fact of the matter is the Congress can and should, that's the important, and should ensure that it is the co-equal branch of government, and this is very important, it is the policy-making branch of government, not the president. The president is an executive. He is to execute the laws that are passed by the Congress of the United States. But the founding fathers surely had in mind, by making the Congress the Article I agency of the government, while co-equal, it was the first among branches because it sets the policy. And then the expectation is the president would carry that out. And as I want to repeat, the founding fathers were very concerned about the usurpation of the people's power by a president who would see himself or herself as king or queen or dictator. Let's pray that the people and their duly elected representatives have the wisdom and the courage to respond in the face of actions which undermine our democracy, our Constitution, and our Declaration of Independence principles. Let's pray that we have that strength, that courage, that determination. Because if we don't, I agree with your premise, then our democracy could be at risk. We ought not to take for granted that our democracy will always exist in a fair and equal way. It is ours to protect, to be eternally vigilant. For if we do not, other countries you mentioned in the last century and centuries before that found the freedom that they had slip away from them because they were not diligent, they were not courageous, they did not confront those who would take power unto themselves unilaterally. I don't know that to be a fact, but I certainly think the implications of much of what he has done are in the interest of Russia and Mr. Putin and not in the interest of the United States of America. In fact, very early on, Mr. McCarthy and I, McCarthy being the Republican leader in the House of Representatives, and I co-sponsored legislation to ensure that the sanctions that were imposed by Congress were in fact implemented by the President, because there was concern that whatever relationship he has with Putin would compromise those sanctions, and that he would not implement them, not assess them. Up until really, frankly, just the last few days, where he said we're going to take all of our troops out of Syria and expose Kurdish troops who have been some of our best allies in fighting ISIS, expose them to attacks by the Turks. He's been roundly criticized by me, by Democrats, but also by many Republicans, that this is a dangerous and irresponsible act for him to take. Now, who benefits by that act? Obviously, Russia, Turkey, led by Mr. Erdogan, who is turning Turkey into a much more authoritarian state, so that from his initial actions on sanctions, his private meeting with Putin, who he told no American what was said, to encouraging the Russians through his people to help him in the 2016 election, to talking to Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, about finding dirt on Biden, his major political opponent, to his actions in Syria just a few days ago, which will benefit Russia. It appears that whatever the relationship between Putin and Trump, and whether or not Putin and Russia have something on the President of the United States, it clearly appears that too often he acts not in the interests of the United States of America, but in the interests of Russia and other autocrats around the world. First of all, we need to make sure we don't shut down government again. That's why passing appropriation bills in a timely fashion, so that you don't meet a deadline. We've already passed the beginning of the fiscal year, October 30th. We're operating under what we call a continuing resolution, which simply authorizes spending beyond the end of the fiscal year for a short period of time to November 21st. Again, the Senate has not passed a single bill. We have passed 96% of the funding of our federal government. So stability is important for a growing economy, a stable economy. And that, I think, is probably our most important objective. But in addition to that, we passed, which I haven't mentioned, but a major piece of legislation to make sure that people who are working full-time in the richest nation on earth aren't living in poverty. We raised the minimum wage, which had not been raised since 2009. 2009. Over 10 years, people at the bottom rung of the salary scale had not been given a raise. And therefore, they were unable to even come close to surviving, even though they were working 40 hours a week.
Absolutely.
So that's going to help our economy here. Federal employees, we made a 3.1% COLA adjustment for federal employees. You talk about the Washington metropolitan region, 3.1% raise, COLA adjustment, cost of living adjustment for federal employees makes a huge impact on our economy. So we're working very hard, but unfortunately, the president acts impulsively, in retribution, in a way that destabilizes, which is why we see this roller coaster on the stock market. Why? Because confidence ebbs and flows so quickly based upon this president's decisions. And frankly, it's going to ebb if we do not have the ability to do our business on time. One thing I'm very concerned about is Democrats are committed to a robust infrastructure program, which creates jobs and helps make us competitive in the 21st century. Sadly, the president walked out on the last meeting we had on infrastructure. You probably remember that. It was on television. and he has not yet come back to the table. And it's so absurd when he says, well, the Democrats are so obsessed with impeachment that he can't do everything. You've heard
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
scores of bills that we have passed, funding of our government we've passed, and it is his Republicans in the Senate who refuse to bring them, put them on the floor.
Right.
Well, first of all, we need to treat people with respect. We need not denigrate people because they are immigrants or Africans or women or Latinos, Latinas. We need to treat people with respect. That does not mean that we ought to have open borders. Every country needs to have secure borders. We need to know who's coming into our country. We need, in fact, to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill. The Senate did that about 6 years ago, and we have been pleading with the Republicans to put it on the floor. They've refused to do so. But the president says we need comprehensive immigration reform. Now, he doesn't do anything to achieve that, but he says that. One thing we did was protect dreamers. That over 85% of Americans believe children brought here as infants or very young children who come to the United States, don't know any country other than the United States, go to our schools, graduate from our schools.
This is home. Absolutely.
This is home for them. You know, but this president, you recall, not too long ago, asked 4 Americans, go back to where you came from.
Very ugly sentiment.
It was an ugly.
Very ugly.
And we called it racist comments.
But is there anything that the state, that Maryland can do to deal with, for example, the threat to breaking up families here in Maryland?
Well, let me say something about it, because you mentioned breaking up families. I was chairman of the Commission on Security and Cooperation here, known as the Helsinki Commission. And I used to go to the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union existed a lot. I mean, 3 or 4 times a year. And one of the things that I was arguing for was family reunification, getting families together. How ironic it is now that we have a president of the United States with some of his advisors who pursued a policy of ripping children, small children, from the arms of their parents, their mom, their dad, and estranging them from their parents, which psychiatrists tell us has a lifelong traumatic adverse impact on the children. So not only do we need comprehensive immigration reform, but we need humane treatment of those seeking asylum under U.S. law. We need to make sure when they're trying to exercise that right that they are treated humanely.
So to be clear, ICE runs into a company here in Maryland, pulls out a number of workers, takes them directly to be deported. Is there anything that we can do, that Maryland will be able to do, to kind of step into that, or is it just what it is until this legislative reform is passed?
No, I think, again, the executive has the opportunity. As you recall, President Obama said, ICE, we're going to prioritize. We want you to get people, which is a small number of people. We want you to get people who are committing crimes, assaulting our people, murder and raping.
Violent.
They're the small, but the president would think, assert that is every immigrant. In fact, immigrants commit crime at a lesser rate than non-immigrants, which is, you know, the American public probably doesn't understand it. But what President Obama said is, get those criminals. We want to get them off the streets, get them out of the country.
Are you comfortable with that approach?
I am comfortable with that approach. But again, that is not to say that we don't need an immigration system that works. We have secure borders, we have accountability, and we make sure that we have a system, because we need immigrants. If you ask the farm community, they will tell you we need immigrants. If you ask the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they will say we need immigrants. You ask the Manufacturing Association, they will say we need immigrants. You ask the hotel industry, they're going to say we need immigrants. The restaurant industry, the landscaping industry, the crab pickers on the eastern shore of our state. They will say,
Absolutely.
we need temporary immigrant workers. So that we need a rational policy. This administration has been talking about, in 2016 in the campaign,
Right.
about a campaign of untruths, of discrimination based upon oversimplification and erroneous information. I think that's a legitimate concern for people. On the other hand, we have a law, and we know that, for instance, in so many countries in the world, there are horrific conditions. You know, we have a Statue of Liberty that says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It is clear that we cannot take all of those huddled masses, but we ought to have a system where we can give refuge to some. Obviously people are rightfully concerned of taking a huge number of people into their community that they don't have the educational resources, health resources, you know, public safety resources. That is a legitimate concern, and we need to deal with it. But you do not deal with it by demagoguing about those who are coming into the country. You solve it by having a system that works, and you take some, and you can't take everybody. Obviously, particularly as it relates to the election of House of Representatives members and U.S. Senators, so there's a very, and President of the United States.
How about that?
There's a very, very strong interest in making sure that elections are fair, that everybody who is eligible to vote can vote, and that everybody who votes has their vote counted. So that there is a very significant interest. I was the sponsor back in the early 2000s of the Help America Vote Act, so-called HAVA. I was the sponsor. We enacted that. Some people called that the greatest civil rights bill in 25 years. I'm not sure that was the case. Talking about since the Americans with Disabilities Act, and of course further back, the Voting Rights Act, the Public Accommodations Act, Fair Housing Act. But the truth is that we have a great interest. We passed a bill, as I said, H.R. 1, which dealt with voting rights. But we now have under consideration and is working through committee another voting rights bill. Two bills, actually. One is to try to make sure that we are secure from foreign interference. And we know it's not just the Russians. We know the Iranians, we know that the Chinese, and we convinced others as well have tried to impact our elections, or at least to compromise our elections in some way. So that we have a great interest. We're pursuing that interest, and of course the President hasn't even admitted, contrary to what CIA says, the FBI says, DIA said, the Defense Intelligence Agency, that the Russians did in fact interfere in our elections. The Mueller report found they interfered in our elections. The Mueller report found that many Trump campaign officials talked to the Russians about interference. Now, of course, we have the President himself talking to the President of Ukraine about interfering in our elections. So this is a great concern to the Congress, great concern of my own, and we are going to be pursuing it vigorously. And we would hope that the administration would not compromise in any way the actions of any of our security agencies in protecting America's elections.
So you're saying there are two, just two more questions. There are two pieces of legislation around this issue that are on the...
A broader Voting Rights Act, which John Lewis is one of the leaders on, and a Secure Act, which tries to strengthen our defenses against foreign intervention in our elections. We passed legislation on that, and we now have a major piece of legislation that we're going to be considering in the next month or so, which will say to drug companies, you can't sell prescription drugs to Americans at a much higher price than you sell around the world. Why should we be disadvantaged because the rest of the world keeps drug prices down and we don't?